Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 8, or if you're counting from the beginning, Episode 20. Please do subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. If you're watching on YouTube, please tap the bell to be notified next time we release an episode. And if you're watching on or listening on Apple Podcasts, please do review the show, as it really does help us to continue to raise our distribution awareness. So just also, real quick reminder at the beginning here, this podcast is sponsored and made possible by Next Wave Partners. Next Wave Partners are experts in renewable energy, infrastructure, ESG, climate tech, and tech recruitment businesses, serving global markets. And if you're looking, to grow your team or to take your career to the next level, please do reach out to Next Wave at info@next-wavepartners.com, or you can go to the website and go under their team page and find the consultant that might be within your remit and within your region, and reach out to them there. Or you can also reach out to them on LinkedIn directly. So the website is next-wavepartners.com. So with that, let's get into the details of today's episode. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Craig Lawrence, who's somebody I've known for a little bit in this space, and he is the co-founder and a partner at Energy Transition Ventures, or ETV for short. The conversation was really focused, just generally speaking, on climate tech investing and kind of his background and how he ended up in the investing space, coming from a technical background. I always find it very fascinating talking to people in this space, because a lot of the founders or kind of big change makers who end up in commercial leadership roles had a technical background at one point or came from a technical background. So it's a very interesting episode. We had a lot of different things we discussed. I will also apologize in advance. There was a few technical difficulties with some of the internet connection, but other than that, it was very good conversation. So with that, let's get right into the show.
All right, welcome to the show, Craig. How's it going?
It's going very well. Great to be here with you.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have you on the show. Obviously, we've talked in the past, but very excited to have you on and to talk about what you guys are doing. So why don't you just give us a quick introduction on yourself, kind of your background, some of your achievements, and maybe a little bit of how you ended up here.
Sounds good. So background, grew up in Miami, Florida. A lot of people think that's strange whenever I tell them, but I did that and was sort of a very technical engineering focused person the entire sort of first half of my life and career. Studied mechanical engineering, was very into things and mechanisms and things that worked and the theory behind how they worked. And so studied engineering, studied at the University of Texas, had a job in the oil and gas industry for a consulting firm doing sort of engineering consulting for large refineries and chemical plants and things like that. Decided real quickly I didn't like that and moved out to California. I went to graduate school at Stanford, continued to study mechanical engineering, product design, had no interest in energy at that point. I'd kind of been turned off by my oil and gas experience and was kind of focused on other areas, and ended up going to work for a company called IDEO, which is a global product design innovation consulting firm. At that time, it was very much an engineering firm. We were designing and building really cool products, medical devices, consumer electronics, furnitures, toys, you name it. IDEO was not an expert in any one particular industry, but just an expert in how to design really cool products. We did work for Apple, Palm Pilot, for those old enough to remember those type of products. Lots of really cool things. And I just happened to be sitting at IDEO. It was probably around 2006, and someone came to the front desk. Someone just sort of walked in the door and said, "Hey, I'm a CEO of a solar company. I'd like to talk to someone at IDEO." And I just was on deck. I was just available, and so I met this CEO of this solar company, which turns out to be First Solar, which is one of the largest and most successful solar companies in the world at the time. They had just IPO'd and were kind of just on their way up, and I ended up doing a project for First Solar, and just I've been an engineer my whole adult life, but was my first exposure to a solar panel, and I was like, okay, this sheet of glass converts sunlight to electricity. It was like magic. It was literally, for me, it was my light bulb moment. No pun intended. And ended up doing a really interesting project with First Solar, and just pretty much was the turning point for me, and said, hey, I'm dedicating my life to this, and sort of started an energy practice at IDEO. That led me to my first sort of investing role, which was at Excel Partners, very successful venture capital firm, early investor in Facebook, and many other very successful tech ventures. Did clean tech with them back when clean tech kind of 1.0 investing was hot and heavy, and folks like Khosla and Kleiner and all these big Silicon Valley venture firms were dumping millions and billions of dollars into clean tech. And we at Excel kind of rode that wave, and we only did 2 investments in the 2 years I was there. One was Sunrun, who's now the #1 residential solar company in the US, probably the world, and then O-Power, which was a really cool software company that IPO'd and then ended up getting bought and integrated into Oracle's utility software offerings. So spent a number of years in solar at companies like SunEdison, at a company called SolarBridge, a startup that got bought by SunPower, and kind of ended up moving me back to Texas. And then last year, myself and a partner, Neil Dykman, kind of looked at the world and kind of looked at what was going on in clean tech and in energy, and said, hey, it might be a good time to start an early stage venture capital fund. So we launched Energy Transition Ventures this year. We're early stage venture capital focused on what we used to call clean tech. We're now calling energy transition or climate tech. These are all sort of different words for overlapping spheres of interest, and we're off to the races. We launched the fund in Q1 this year, and we've done a couple of investments and are out looking for more.
Awesome, very cool. I think this is very interesting to me that you have an engineering background and then have ended up in this investment space. I think maybe could you talk about that a little bit, because I think I'd be curious to learn if you have any context on the past and how traditionally kind of it works for finance people or investment firms in general versus what might be different with climate tech technologies and companies.
Yeah, I think what made Excel interested in me was my engineering background, right? So I was originally brought in really to be sort of the technical due diligence person at that firm, and so certainly having that engineering background helps. A lot of the things going on, and I do apologize if you hear that barking in the background.
No worries, no worries. We keep it real on this podcast.
A lot of the the stuff, particularly going on in Clean Tech 1.0, was very technical in nature, right? People were doing fundamental material science R&D, whether it's thin film solar cells or new battery materials, and so the traditional tech investors were sort of reliant on other experts to help them evaluate that stuff, either from the semiconductor industry or whatever. So that was originally my, sort of my mandate. And so I had no investing or finance knowledge, right? I didn't go to business school. I hadn't done investing, hadn't run a business. So I kind of picked that up on the fly at Excel. I didn't really realize this at the time, but Excel is one of the, probably the best, one of the top best venture firms in the world. And so I was learning from some of the best at it in the world. And so I feel very blessed and lucky to have had that experience and to be, kind of watching how these folks operated. And so long rambling, answer to your question is, I think it is still relevant today. Many of the energy and climate investments have a kind of fundamental core technology that's beyond, software. that you're dealing with physics. You are moving electrons around the real world. Um, but I recognize my limitations. I developed expertise. I did a PhD in a very specific area and have a lot of strong expertise in that area, but that rarely comes to bear in the specific deals we're looking
Mm-hmm.
at. I think having an understanding of what to look for and how to look at it, and continues to benefit me to this day. But I had to pick up a whole new set of skills, and frankly, why I partnered up with my partner Neil, who's spent much more time in finance and has really focused all of his career in finance, has really been helpful for me, and as a compliment.
Yeah, to me that seems like it's a pretty interesting partnership because from what I've gathered, again, I've never spent any time in the finance space on that side of things, but seeing how people invest in tech companies where it's about the team over the technology, because hey, the tech it's just code, right? They can recode it to make things different, to make it fit the needs of the customer. But with climate tech issues, it has to be good technology, right? If the technology is bad or it doesn't work, then it's entirely a waste of investment. You can always, stack different people around the tech as long as the tech is good. Is that something that you'd say is consistent with what you've seen?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of great opportunities that really don't have a fundamental technology. I mean, I think about my past investment, Sunrun. This is a financial innovation, right? And that was really important for solar. And I spent time at SunEdison, who's kind of considered the pioneers of those financial innovations. There really wasn't a technology there. Same with O-Power. I mean, O-Power built software, but it wasn't rocket science. It was
Hmm.
more behavioral science. Really, is where their innovation lies. And I think I tend to gravitate towards these things that are sort of more business model innovations, where you really are looking at the team, the product, maybe not the technology, and the market. And I think that's where a lot of the opportunity lies. I think that's where a lot of our investment will come in. There still is technology innovation needed, and we have an investment that's not been announced yet, so unfortunately, but it's in the sort of power electronics space where it's a real fundamental new technology, and we invested because the team was extremely strong technically. These are folks who had been in other power companies like
Hmm.
Siemens and Tico Westinghouse, and companies that have with long track records of being able to deliver power products into the market. And you don't necessarily trust something like that to someone fresh out of school.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, that brings us, I guess, to the question of kind of, is there a specific remit that you have at Energy Transition Ventures, or is there maybe a specific type of maybe it's methodology or things that you look for maybe people who are interested in seeing if they'd be a good fit for what you guys are looking at?
Yeah, I think our remit is simple. We're looking to back category defining companies that are either driving or benefiting from the transition of our energy economy off of fossil fuels and onto more sustainable sources. So within that remit, we are looking very broadly. From a stage standpoint, we are kind of an early stage investor. So we're looking. We will do a person with an idea. We will invest at that early of a stage, all the way through, potentially a later stage venture round, where, I think that kind of canvas, it creates pretty open environment, and I am very much, I want my funnel of the opportunities we see to be as large as possible within that remit, because frankly, you can have a thesis, you can have themes that you're focused on, but at the end of the day, you have to find compelling entrepreneurs who are building these companies and these businesses and these products. And that's really ultimately, you're looking for that person, that team, that is sort of built to be successful, whether it's in technology or marketing or sales or whatever element of it is that's most needed. And we're going to be opportunistic when those teams come around. We're going to want to back them. So, like I said, the filter is very wide open. So, I'd encourage anybody who kind of even comes close to that remit to reach out to us.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that that's an interesting perspective. I feel that a lot of the funds nowadays have specific themes. I'm not sure if there's maybe reasons behind that, but I think it's an interesting way to look at it, especially given your team setup, because you're able to really sort through those nicely. Um, Curious to
I
understand.
would just add to that. I'm seeing that too. I'm seeing kind of specialty funds, like we're a hydrogen fund or we're a carbon capture fund. And from my perspective, I think that was too narrow. We thought about that, but our feeling, and just based on my experience, sort of during the last wave of clean tech, is there weren't a ton of very successful outcomes, right? And I'm not sure this time will be that different. I think there will be more. But I think you got to have a wide enough net to catch all those successful companies. I think we didn't want to go too narrow. I think energy is narrow enough for us.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that you obviously have to diversify what you're doing in order to continue being successful, right? Because this is something, maybe you could talk about this. Having been through maybe, what we call Clean Tech 1.0, could you talk about the mentality that had kind of developed? Because my understanding is that it was kind of people were like, oh, we don't want to touch that anymore because a lot of people lost their investment. Is that the case? Did people come around to that? Or is it the case that a lot of these investments just didn't have time to mature?
So I think the failure, the failures of Clean Tech 1.0, and by the way, I don't think there's a lot of analysis, sort of after the fact analysis, looking back at the returns, and it's not as clear cut as you think to be like, oh, that was a failure. I mean, Tesla alone, is such a hugely valuable company that it drives the overall returns for the whole sector. So, if you were in a few of the good companies, you actually could have done very well. But I think the mistake that was made, the mistakes that were made in Clean Tech 1.0 are pretty simple to understand. And it was, go back to 2000, I don't know, whenever you think this Clean Tech 1.0 started, 2005, 2007, 2008, it peaked somewhere in that sort of 2005 to 2011, 12 timeframe, in terms of dollars invested. And what was going on back then? Well, solar was kind of new, wind was a little more mature, but still kind of new, batteries were kind of new, EVs were kind of new. And what did they all have in common? They were just very, very expensive, right? So solar, wind, batteries, EVs, just sort of the most expensive methods of producing electricity, right? Or using electricity. And so, but everyone saw promise, and there were some subsidies that sort of helped some of these things get to market, and there were some mandates and feed-in tariffs, and these markets were growing, and they were clearly pointing to a very, very large opportunity. And so, what did venture capital do? They said, "Well, this technology is expensive. We're venture capitalists. We're good. Let's invest in ways to make these technologies cheaper." So tremendous amount of money going into thin film solar, a tremendous amount of money going into new battery technologies or materials, a tremendous amount of money going into biofuels. And almost all of that was sort of based on the current method of doing solar or batteries, whatever, too expensive to be viable. So we're going to invest in something that has the promise to make it cheaper. Here's the problem. Was those technologies, a lot of them were at what I would consider to be a fundamental R&D stage. They were in the lab. right? So you have venture capitalists funding fundamental R&D, which is just hard. It's just hard and it's expensive and it's unpredictable. And there's not much that the venture capitalists can do to accelerate that. They can try to throw more money at it, but that doesn't necessarily accelerate it. So you're doing something very, very hard. And in the meantime, the stuff that was so expensive, silicon solar cells, lithium ion batteries, wind turbines, they just kept getting cheaper. And they kept getting cheaper faster than anyone predicted. And I can go pull up my decks from these thin film solar companies that they pitched me, where they're predicting where their costs are going to be and where the industry costs are going to be when they get to market. And they were just wrong. Their costs were higher. They took longer to get to market because it's fundamental R&D, and the market just passed them by, right? So most of those investments failed because they mispriced the risks, the market risks, the technology risks. Today, we're at a fundamentally different spot, which is those core technologies are now the cheapest way of producing electricity. So solar, wind, and soon, if not now, batteries as storage for solar and wind or other forms of electricity are now just really fundamentally cheap. They're fundamentally better products for a whole host of reasons, and than the alternatives. And so we're in a different world. So now I look at it, and why we started this fund, which is now we can, now we know these markets are going to be huge because they're economically driven, not subsidy driven, or just, we'd like to be clean driven. They're just cheaper. So now there's going to be whole sets of industries and businesses built on top of these very, very inexpensive clean electrons. So that was the problem of Clean Tech 1.0. I see it being repeated, unfortunately, in Clean Tech, whatever you call it, 2.0 or climate tech, which is people are looking at things like hydrogen and carbon capture, which are very expensive today, and saying, well, let's go invest our venture dollars in R&D in fundamental new science and technology to make them cheaper. Look, I want to see investment in that fundamental R&D and science. Like, I think it's absolutely vital, as it was during solar. But I just don't know if it's an appropriate use of venture capital dollars. The other thing that's changed from then to now is, back then it was only venture. Like, that was it. Like, you had venture capital and there was no one to hand off those things to, right? Like, there was no growth capital, there was no private equity, there was no infrastructure capital, there was no corporate capital, the public markets really weren't that interested in these things. So there was just no follow-on capital. So you had venture capitalists funding the building of factories, right? For, solar. Now it's very, very different. You can't open your browser, if you follow the kind of accounts and news that I follow, and not see the announcement of another like multi-billion-dollar fund, whether it's an infrastructure fund or a growth fund or a private equity fund or SPAC. There's now lots of capital up and down the stack to support these businesses. And that's why we jumped into early stage capital. We said, hey, look, renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. There's capital to support these young businesses as they grow. So but there's not a lot of early stage venture still. I mean, I think, there's less than there was, I suspect, in Clean Tech 1.0 right now.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because I was actually curious about that given maybe people have a little bit of cold feet per se, because it was all of the early stage funds that kind of really took it badly in the first round. So it's interesting that you guys are doing that, but it's interesting to hear your perspective too, that there is the infrastructure beyond the seed stage to help, take things to the next levels. And obviously, I think public opinion of these things has gone up a lot. I'm curious, are there specific examples aside from, power generation? Are there specific examples of other technologies that you've seen or invested in that just make more sense economically for the clients that they're serving, whether it's a building technology or something like that. Are there any examples? Because I'm always curious to share these examples with people so they can see the reason why this is so important for us to move in this direction.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. And unfortunately, the investment hasn't been announced, so I'm going to be a little more vague than I would normally like to. Happy to come back on and give you more. But we invested in a power electronics company. So these folks are solving a problem for first application they're focused on is EV charging. So DC fast charging, and you'll hear a lot when people talk about charging infrastructure, which is, oh, it's expensive because you have to do grid upgrades, right? The grid's sort of not built to deliver the kind of power to a site to charge a bunch of EVs simultaneously with 250 kilowatts of power each. So you need to do grid upgrades, which by that they mean typically you're installing transformers, switchgear, inverters, safety protection. And this stuff is very expensive, right? You need to get permits, you need to lay a concrete pad, you're trenching, you're running conduit. And this ends up becoming kind of like in solar, they talk about soft costs, which is sort of everything other than the panel. It starts to add up and become a substantial barrier to EV charging. So we invested in a company that's doing a really interesting technology, leveraging sort of solid state transformer technology to significantly lower the size, cost, increase the efficiency of the grid infrastructure needed to deliver EV fast charging. So, the obvious customers for this are fleets that are electrifying, where, you've got a bunch of delivery trucks or a bunch of vehicles where, charging fast is important because it directly hits your bottom line. You're going to be building a lot of charging. We are going to be building a lot of charging infrastructure over the next decade. Amazon, UPS, post office, everybody who's looking to electrify their vehicles would need a product like this. So we invested in an early stage technology company that's doing some smart stuff around power electronics. It's not fundamental R&D, it's engineering, right? It's engineering, it's better engineering, better design of this type of solution. And that's an area we got excited about, and we made a very early bet at the seed stage in a good company doing this.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's just so many examples I think of people I've had on here where it's kind of a no-brainer for companies to implement the technology because it saves them money or maybe even adds them revenue streams. To me, you mentioned this earlier, the new business models. To me, that's very interesting. There's so many. I feel it's just not something a lot of people, some people of course, but not a lot of people like think about, oh, how can I innovate the way this is done? And oftentimes that can be just a huge innovation itself and can just open up the market because it reduces the barriers. So that's interesting to hear. What are, in your opinion, some of the areas that you see the most growth happening within this climate tech space over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so where I'm seeing growth, I think energy storage is an underreported like tsunami coming, and it's not without risk. I mean, we just saw Chevy announce a full recall of the Chevy Bolt, right, because of a battery defect issue. We saw a kind of a thermal event, which is the battery way of saying, a fire at a stationary storage installation in California recently. So, these things are not easy to do, but there's 30 gigawatts of battery storage in the queue in ERCOT in Texas. These are projects that are in various stages of development or installation or connection to the grid. 30 gigawatts is a lot of power. Most of this is sort of 4-hour lithium ion type battery storage. There's a equal, I don't know the number offhand, but I think a greater amount in California that's sort of in development. And I mean, you know, there is no better power device on the grid than a battery. It is just super flexible, highly controllable, fast, dynamic, multi-use, really, really powerful thing to have on the grid. And the cool thing about it is it's scalable, right? You could have an individual small battery system in a home to a large utility scale, multi-gigawatt, multi-megawatt, tens of megawatts installation. You can place it because it's not polluting and doesn't need fuel and isn't burning fuel and creating exhaust. You can place it in all kinds of interesting spaces where it's needed on the grid. So that's a huge area. I'm super excited about that and what that means for our ability to deploy more renewables on the grid. And then electric vehicles. I mean, again, I think that's a tsunami coming. I think it's fits and starts. The change in tone I've heard from the auto manufacturers from a decade ago, when I talked to a Volkswagen executive who said, why would we do electric vehicles when we have diesel? Like diesel's so much more efficient, right? Or why would we do hybrids when we have diesel? Diesel's so much more efficient. So and now it's like they basically saying they're going to phase out fossil fuel engines and at some point and be all electric. So that's super exciting. And then this is where it all intersects, which is I'm on the waiting list for electric Ford F-150, right? And the reason I am is not because I want a truck. I've never had a truck in my life, but because they're the first company that's really promoted the vehicle to grid concept. And I live in Austin. I was out of power for a week earlier this year when we had the massive snow apocalypse here and froze out our grid. And I had no backup. Right here I am, and I've been in this industry for 15 years. I got solar on my roof, but it's grid tied solar. I had no backup. So I'm getting that F-150. It's got a 100-watt-hour battery that can back my house up for a week. That literally can back my house up for a week. And I think that this is just a game changer. It's just an absolute game changer.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, especially because I mean, from where I'm from a rural area in Wisconsin, and typically you maybe the lower on the progressive end of things for new technologies per se. And having conversations with my dad about, hey, if you get a truck, like here's the benefits of what you could get in an electric truck, right? For example, so that's interesting to see. I'm curious, do you know of maybe kind of things or predictions you have, given the increase in battery storage usage and how we're going to be able to track all this data a lot better? Do you see any kind of big movements or things that you're excited for where data is going to be able to intersect with all of these things that we're doing within the energy side of things?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's so many cool, innovative companies who are sort of launching around. This is what I get excited about. I think whether it's the tech world or the energy world, I'm looking for sort of ecosystems forming, right? And in solar and in silicon solar, that there's these huge ecosystems from the supply chain downstream to developers and installers, and then technology companies that are trying to make these things work better, addressing soft costs. And I'm seeing the same thing in the battery world, right? Everything from really cool companies that are working on, sort of testing and battery health and diagnostics, right? So that you can track battery performance either, from the factory through to into the car or into the stationary storage system. And so much data being collected on these things to help feedback and improve the product and the manufacturing, to people focused on like second life use for batteries, right? So people figuring out how to take these batteries, for a car, when a battery's at 80%, capacity, you might not, it might be kind of done for the car, right? Your range is diminished, your performance might be diminished, but it's been paid for and amortized and depreciated, and so to go stick that into a stationary storage system where maybe size isn't that important, and the fact that it's 70, 80, 60% capacity, still perfectly usable. And so I see so many different pieces, and then even everything like there's companies that are like, developing, software and APIs to monitor and control EVs, and to basically, assess the value of the car, and again, you tie it back to the vehicle to grid, where the car becomes a resource for the grid, right? And then there's how you're going to orchestrate and control all that. And people have been talking about this for decades, and it's like just starting to happen, right? The place, there were a lot of companies trying to do this back when I was at Excel. There was a company doing vehicle to grid. There were no electric cars hardly, right? There was no Tesla, and hardly any cars that could do that. They were just too early with that idea,
Mhm.
right? It's still maybe a little too early, right? Still, Ford and Nissan, I think, are the only companies that have even made sort of that capability available, and Tesla hasn't yet, even, right? And they've got the most EVs on the road. You can't back up your home with your Tesla. There are a lot of people who have a Tesla sitting in their garage with 100 kilowatt-hour battery, 90 kilowatt-hour battery, but they like 13, 14 kilowatt-hours to back up their house with that fully charged EV sitting there, in the garage unused.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if once this is implemented, I never actually thought about that concept, but if once it's implemented, the power outages that you guys experienced in Texas, for example, if enough people kind of had this ability to just plug into their truck, for example, it would have probably saved a lot of headache for a lot of people and a lot of pain and suffering. This interesting concept. That's a new one for me. What about your journey, whether it's your entire career or maybe specifically so far with ETV? What have been kind of the biggest surprises to you, the things that you just did not expect?
It's a really good question. I feel like I've had a lot of surprises, right? Like, I mean, the falling into venture during Clean Tech 1.0, just was never on my roadmap at all of things to do. And I remember I had the job offer from Excel. It was a short-term offer. Had this job at IDEO, which probably not well known in Wisconsin, but if IDEO was one of those places, one of the most desirable places to work. And I'm like, God, am I going to really leave this job? And I just took a leap of faith and jumped in, and the whole thing was shocking. I mean, still to this day, I'm kind of amazed at how venture capital works, and just the movement of money from LPs to GPs to startups. It feels kind of inefficient all the time. I think about it, and I'm I'm excited to be doing what I'm doing, and kind of thankful every day I get to do it. But on the other hand, it just seems odd of how this money gets to the startups, through such a torturous path, right? Like, and to be kind of a gatekeeper in that path is a daunting position. I will say I'm shocked at how practical I've become. I kind of viewed myself in my engineering phase of my career as a dreamer, right? And so every time I see a funding announcement from someone's invested $100 million in nuclear fusion or some crazy new storage technology or whatever. I'm like, I would have thought that would have been me early in my career. But the reality is I get much more excited about opportunities that can have immediate impact, right? And so, companies like Sunrun and O-Power, when we did it, the companies we're invested in today, I mean, they are either already out in the market making an impact, or they're really, really close. And so I find that that immediate satisfaction of being able to see what I'm working on and what I'm involved in having impact right away versus kind of grinding it out in the lab for many years is I'm surprised, because I did a PhD. I spent 4 years in the lab working on one thing, right, to see it kind of finally sort of come to fruition at the end of that time. And so I thought that was kind of who I was. But I think I need a lot more instant gratification.
That's interesting. That's yeah, I don't think I could be the person who sits on one thing for a long time, but that's interesting to hear your perspective of how it's changed. I think it's interesting also that we obviously need both, right? We need a little bit of both, because if there's nobody dreaming up the next things, we're never going to have the next thing. So that's interesting. Maybe just a couple more things here. What have you seen in terms of with the portfolio companies you're working with, or just maybe companies you've seen in general? Um, how have you seen them having to find talent? Because I've talked to a lot of people who have issues with there's no education per se that's helping get people into these paths, these career paths that are really meant for these new technologies, because it's just unknown to the universities. And obviously universities are typically a couple years behind the trend. So I'm just curious, what have you seen there? What have been the challenges, and maybe what's being done to change that in the future?
There's the talent is definitely an issue. There's the issue with, like, young talent, people coming out of school, or, people coming into this industry. I think there's some gaps and holes there. But before I talk about that, the talent area that's sort of hitting me directly, because I am seeing a lot of smart people from other industries kind of with a desire to get into this industry. I think it's great, and I think there's a lot of people moving into it. One of the thing that I see lacking right now is kind of senior, experienced, sort of executive talent available for these startups. Some of the best executives that I met along the way, sort of during the 15 years, I've approached a number of them to sort of join some of these startups we're funding, saying, hey, we've got a really cool technical team, whatever, but they could really benefit from someone who's done it before, who's taken a company from A to B and had an exit and whatever. And many of them are like, I'm not, I'm kind of done. I'm past that, right? I've kind of aged out of the startup world. So I think that's kind of a shame. I'd actually like to see senior folks who have done it before. Maybe they're even financially set, right? Maybe they don't need the money or the big exit, but to go back and to sort of work in these sort of more entrepreneurial startup companies. So that's where I'm seeing a big gap. And then on the sort of that are trying to train people both in entrepreneurship and in climate. So I think that's pretty healthy, actually. I think that there's a lot of that going on. Universities are creating climate programs, degrees, entrepreneurship, and I'm pretty bullish on all that stuff that's happening there.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, because I've heard different things depending on how crazy the technology is, that it's just tough to find people because the engineers are looking for that have the correct motivations and everything. Maybe they were headed in a different path and they have to be convinced to change that path because it's just new technology. So that's interesting to hear. Maybe one other thing kind of along this line is, as a lot of these technologies transition, we're obviously going to be replacing some of our existing infrastructure or just the way we do things. What do you see as happening to the current workforce? And are there any things that you're seeing that's being done to help kind of get that workforce up to run into this new technology? So that way there's not really so much of a gap, because this is a big concern from a lot of rural areas. Like people have kind of, typical blue collar jobs, and they're like, hey, how are we going to be involved in this transition? We don't want to be out of work.
Yeah, it's sort of this. It's been an ongoing topic. I mean, going back, right? It's like, hey, when we started to, it was very clear that the country had sort of turned against coal. I mean, going back more than 10 plus years, and that there was going to be an issue with people in the coal industry in those states. And I don't think we did a good job of sort of creating opportunities, because frankly, those states aren't where the opportunities were in renewables, really, right? Like, West Virginia and some of those places in Pennsylvania really weren't big renewables states, right? That was going on in California and Massachusetts. And so, you're really going to up, and a lot of this stuff is, you got to be there, right? This isn't remote work kind of work. It's like I'm turning a wrench, or I'm digging a trench, right? Like, so I think it's interesting now that places like Texas have become a renewable development stronghold. I mean, solar, wind, and storage. Texas is one of the biggest states. Texas is also one of the biggest oil and gas states, right? So I think that opportunity to transfer talent at the engineering, the construction level, the operations and maintenance level, I think it's big. I think there's a bit of a stigma. We're a little bit, the sort of new energy people are a little bit dismissive of the old energy people. I think that's horrible. I think that the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, those folks are the original risk takers, the original entrepreneurs in this country, really. I mean, like these are people taking risks on business technology development, and they're also smart, right? From everywhere, from the technical and the blue collar, all the way up to the finance people and private equity people. I mean, these folks are smart, they're sophisticated, would love to have their energy turned towards this renewable build out that we're encouraging here. And I don't have that answer. I don't know how much of it's happening. I just do know that that there's been some dismissiveness that I think is a shame.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it was back shortly after the ERCOT disaster that I stumbled into a clubhouse room, and I just heard, I thought it was a renewable energy clubhouse room, but it turned out to be mostly oil and gas folks. And it was interesting to hear their perspective on how they felt like people on our side of things, if you want to say it, our side per se, were just really like you said, dismissive, or just kind of like didn't care to bring them in, because I think that's a good point you mentioned, that they were the first innovators. So I think that maybe people listening, if maybe check your LinkedIn comments, how are you sharing this, because this is obviously, they do have talent. We need to be aware of bringing those people in, and maybe for hiring managers, I've seen this as a recruiter too, that hiring managers tend to be like, hey, I only want people who already have the experience, whereas who knows, maybe sometimes it's going to be better off to have somebody who has the context from the other types of roles. But awesome. This has been great. I think we're out of time now. Just curious if you have any final thoughts that you wanted to wrap up with.
Yeah, I would say this. I'm as optimistic as I've ever been. Like I said, I got excited back when all this stuff was a pipe dream, really. I mean, it was a heavily subsidized, expensive experiment, putting solar on people's roofs or on buildings or in solar farms and building wind turbines. And I just, I don't know how it seems to the rest of the world, because I can only, know my perspective, but it has come so far so fast. And I think it's underreported, right? Like, I think a lot of the conventional wisdom is still what is talked about, right? And we talked about the sort of, potential animosity between the traditional energy, oil and gas world and the new energy world. I live it. I'm very active on Twitter, at C Lawrence, if anyone wants to find me. And I'm in these communities. There's these very strong communities of oil and gas folks that I've stumbled into, And I find myself in, anything from polite discussions to Twitter wars over, over renewables. But like that, those people, and I think they are reflective of the broader population, have some notions about renewable energy, wind, solar, batteries, that is 10 years plus out of date. And 10 years ago, it was true, and it's not today. And I think there's an education process. The media, we are all responsible for helping people understand that it's not your 2010 solar and wind industry. It's a whole different ballgame now. And so I'm super excited about where we are. I in my mind, it's very clear. It's all going to change. We are going to transition off fossil fuels. I know it's going to be faster than people are projecting. I don't know how fast. I think a lot depends on what we all do, right? The investments we all make in people, in technology, in products, in policy, that are going to make the difference. So I will wake up every day kind of excited and just try to do my part.
Awesome. Very good. Well, I'm glad to hear the excitement from somebody who kind of is holding the purse strings and can see it from that level. So very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show, Craig. We'll have to have you on in the future, especially as you announce more investments and as we see this energy transition take place.
Yeah, we'd love to be back on. You should definitely grab my partner Neil too. He's a fun character to have on these things. So
awesome. Thanks so much, Craig. Cheers.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode. Really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Craig. I really enjoy speaking with him every time I do get the chance to connect with him. So again, hope you found a lot of value. Please do share your thoughts on what you thought of the podcast, any questions you'd like asked in further episodes. I will have a number of other financial professionals in the space in the near future. So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Silas Maynor or join the Slack channel, which the link is in the description. And you can Slack me. I'm pretty good about getting back to people there as well. You can also connect to me on LinkedIn. So many ways to reach me. I'm always glad to take your questions and try to add them into the conversation next time. As always, we do ask you that you share this with a friend of yours. So if there's anybody who might find this topic interesting, please share it with them, as we need to spread the word about what's happening. And please also consider subscribing to the newsletter, which comes out the 27th of every month. And as I mentioned before, do join the Slack channel if you're interested in kind of participating in the space a little bit more, meeting other professionals, or just learning in general. And then finally, you can support the show by going to Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. It's buymeacoffee.com/Silas Maynor. And with that, we will see you next time on the podcast.